Good afternoon. Welcome to our first lecture in a mini-series on agroecology and the transition to sustainable food systems. Welcome here in the classrooms, students from ETH Zurich, but also welcome back home or in office or wherever you are for our this year's public lecture series on agroecology. My name is Martin Sonneveld. I'm the Executive Director of the World Food System Center, and I'm very happy to host you here at this hybrid event on agroecological transformation. The first lecture is starting with the scientific perspective on agroecology and the transformation of food systems. Next week on Tuesday, we are going to have Madeleine Kaufmann and Isabel Sommer with us. They will share their view from a policy perspective on agroecology, both nationally in Switzerland, but also internationally. And then this mini-series ends on the 22nd of October with an input by Stefanie Bondini and Rémi Cluzet on the role of agroecology for food system transformation and what kind of tool agroecology is to support the transformation of food systems. I'm not going into detail on what agroecology is because Robert Finger, who will start today, he has some slides on the introduction of agroecology ready, but maybe it's important to highlight that agroecology is a holistic and integrated approach that simultaneously applies ecological and social concepts, principles to the design and the management of sustainable agriculture, but also food system as such. Agroecology has been defined as a science, a set of practice, and a social movement. And as concept, it has evolved over the recent decades and expanded its scope from what is more agroecology on field and farm level to the entire agricultural and food system as such. And this is also something which we are going to explore in this mini-series today and in the next two events. Agroecological transition aims to simultaneously achieve multiple sustainability objectives. Economic one, environmental one, social ones, but also questions of nutrition and health and culture within food system is a key element of the agroecological understanding and the way food system can be perceived. It's always a key element to have an integrative view at different levels from field, farm, to the agricultural system in total, but also food systems. So we're talking about a concept which tries to bridge between various levels, various scales, but also has the contextual perspective and the contextual perspective is a key element to agroecology as well. So it depends, when we talk about agroecology, what kind of system do we look at in terms of scale, but also in terms of location, depending on different economic structures, but also the agroclimatic condition as such. And that's what we're here for, to share various perspectives on agroecology. And this lecture aims to build a fundament for a continuous dialogue on how we can use agroecology as a concept for food system transformation. And with that, it's a pleasure to welcome Robert Finger and Kenza Benabderatic to us today. Robert is a professor here at ETH Zurich in agricultural economics and policy, and Kenza works within the group of sustainable agro-ecosystem and is there a lecturer in various lectures on agroecology, but has also a deep knowledge on various research projects within the group, which she will go to share with us. You have, of course, the possibility to ask questions either on the chat or after the two presentations in plenum And we try to make the connections from outside back to the lecture halls, but also you students, of course, you have the chance to ask questions to these two presenters today. So without any further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome both Robert and Kenza to us today. And I ask you, Robert, to join me here. I will leave and the floor is yours. Thank you, Robert, for being with us.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation. Really a great pleasure to be here. Welcome here and welcome also remotely. I hope, there we are. Yes, it's a pleasure to talk here, and I will also indicate where maybe then the talks divide. So I give a general introduction and then hand over to a specific part that Kenza covers, and then I take over another one. This is based on a paper that was jointly written with Frank Ebert and Roland Bartz from the SAL. I will show which paper I mean in a minute or so. But before I jump into agroecology as such, I want to highlight some key challenges. What are we actually talking about? What is the problem that we actually want to address? And at the food system level, we have various ground challenges ahead. First of all, we are still in a phase without any doubt where in the coming years and even decades, we see an increasing demand for food. We also see an increasing demand for specific ecosystem services that we want from the agriculture sector, like carbon sequestration, one example, where there's a lot of emphasis, agriculture should deliver more. The same moment in time, we see that the production potential of agriculture is rapidly declining. Just two examples, soil degradation is taking away a lot of the production potential currently, and the same holds for climate change that already has a strong footprint in our production today and even will have a stronger one in the future. This means producing, delivering the same is increasingly becoming more difficult and more costly. So just maintaining what we do today is becoming more challenging. And we also have increasingly resilience challenges, whether they come from climatic extreme events or also from wars and other shocks and challenges. And of course, the agriculture and food system as large is massively responsible for the sustainability issues we have globally in terms, for example, of greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, pollution, but also in social sustainability dimensions. So this is very clear. We need to kind of like produce somehow more, despite the fact that our resources are under pressure, and we need to reduce the footprint massively. And this is also a very clear goal in any policy document that you can open on a national, regional, global level. Always it's going to say, well, this is the goal, to reduce the footprint, produce more, be more resilient. This is very clear and very easy, these strategies, but how to actually make it happen from a strategy to action, this is far more debatable. And of course, there is not a single measure and not a single technology that solves it all, but there are various proposals on the table, what to do. And there are various concepts that have been proposed, and to be honest, concepts come on a quite frequent range. So after your studies, other concepts might be proposed already, but you see some listed here that have been proposed in the last years and decades: sustainable intensification, organic farming, conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture is a big thing in a moment, ecological intensification, and agroecology. They all have a lot of overlaps in specific things and others not. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, so to say, but just one observation that I think is important also for that lecture series is that agroecology is among the most comprehensive, because it actually captures many of the elements that are listed elsewhere. But it shouldn't be either or, but it's kind of like integrating things in a good way. You also see on the right-hand side that the literature in that field actually took up quite rapidly. So agroecology, Martin indicated, it is like a very dynamic concept that develops also rapidly over time and developed rapidly. So, for example, seen as a part of science, but also practices and the social movement that was mentioned. And yeah, and there are different ways to conceptualize it and say, well, what is it actually? And then, of course, there are three main elements that I would like to highlight, like the Gliessmann levels here, that actually indicate on the left-hand side, you see the range from incremental changes to transformational changes. And of course, we want to have a transformation of the agri-food system. And you also see along these levels, if you go up, we start with the agroecosystems, so agricultural and transforming agriculture, and then integrate also the food system transformation step by step. So there are different kind of like levels along we operate, from efficiency gains to substitution to redesign, and then kind of like redesigning also the food system. And then there are other important definitions and concepts that have been proposed. One are the 10 FAO elements that you see in the middle, and then the high-level panel of experts published the 13 principles that you see on the right-hand side. And you see certain elements that pop up that are very, to me, at the core of agroecology, like diversity, synergies, recycling, efficiency, resilience, but also responsibility, fairness, and so on. And this is an important element. We also will go back during the following lectures again and again to these individual aspects. And it's clear looking at that big picture that relates to kind of like agricultural practices, but also relates to people, the people that are in the societies that we want to transform, whether these are farmers, consumers, but of course, there are also institutions. And from here, we have two pathways where we can go ahead. One is we can look at specific examples of success. This is the nice story that Kenza is going to tell also, zooming into where does actually agroecology work and where not. And then there's this big picture, kind of like how to bring that concept to fly very high and be the game changer at the global level. And I will try to address these points, which is less specific, less sexy, and sometimes also asks more nasty questions, because we have to also talk what are the limiting factors and how to actually integrate agroecology also in bigger developments. I will draw, as indicated, from a paper that we've written with Frank and Roland. And in my presentation, I will basically look at three different elements from a very kind of global level. First of all, what is the evidence from the literature, state of agroecology research? Just share a few insights here. Then it was a question for us in the paper, what should we do to mainstream agroecology? And maybe it's the wrong word, but it's mainly asking the question, how can it become the mainstream kind of concept for transformation? What is needed to scale up at the global level? And then a question that arises is when talking about scaling up, enlarging the scope where agroecology is actually practiced and put into kind of real world practices and systems, what is actually limiting it? And there are various factors that limit it and are also enabling and success factors, but I would like to highlight on three. One is economics. The second is the role of new technologies and the role of public policy. Zooming into the literature, we went into the peer-reviewed literature and looked what is actually the state of agroecological research. First of all, observation, there is an increasing research in that field, which is very applaudable and good. Second observation is there are different subfields and not shown here, but often they are a bit kind of divided. Agroecology in the small, agroecology at the large system level, and sometimes the connection. What I find more important also for the discussions to come in that lecture is comparing the peer-reviewed literature. This is the left panel with the words that you see here, and the documents by the FAO that are kind of extremely important for defining what agroecology is in the view of the FAO, and comparing what are the most important terms used. And to me, very striking, because I'm an agriculture economist and work mainly at the level of the farm, is that the peer-reviewed literature, farmer is not a very important thing to show up, but actually, and very importantly, in the documents of the FAO, farmers are very important. So this is one key takeaway: put farmers in the center of that exercise, and I will also come back to it in a second. The second observation, we looked not only at the most frequent terms, but also other terms that we felt are important for our analysis. And just want to highlight in that red box here specific things that you see not very often represented, like for example, digitalization is something that is sometimes not even mentioned if we talk about agroecology. The same with breeding technologies and so on, they just play a minor role. And one of my takeaways is going to be they shouldn't be only marginalized, but actually can also play an important role in that concept. So this is just like one example into that literature. The second question was like how to scale agroecology in terms of conceptualizing how to do that. And I just want to kind of like oversimplify a bit the exercise. You see on the left-hand side the scale that goes from the field to the global scale, and then you see on the x-axis here a move from kind of like the production side to trading to actually in the end to consumers. And where agroecology started like decades ago was very much focused on the field and the production. And there was a big move to actually integrate systems, sectors, networks, markets, going from the left to the right, and also going a bit up, higher to the regional level. But what we actually need to have that kind of like global goal that we want to meet, that I indicated in the very beginning, we also need to change global production and global consumption patterns. And it's the question how to link the things in the small to the links in the large, like how to go from here to there. Is it like with many small kind of like institutions and activities, or do we also need to involve other actors at other scales, like national, global scale, kind of which institutions do we need for that transformation? So it's a far from easy question, but I think it's an important one to actually think about how to move from bottom left to actually top right where we want to land. And it's not a concept where one size fits it all, but this is a concept that needs continuous kind of like co-development, testing, evaluation at different levels and integration. And this also implies that agroecology should not at all be detached from food system approaches and all the things that matter for us that we want to achieve, like food availability, access. We shouldn't forget about the environmental impacts that food systems have, and also not forget about the food value chains that actually we operate in. So it's really kind of like a connecting agroecology with the transformation to sustainable agri-food systems. So here I talked about the big picture, but I want to come back to one point that I made in the beginning. There is no agroecological transformation if there is not a farmer actually changing their practices. So you can propose whatever you want. If farmers don't do and don't produce in a specific way, it's very hard to think about a transformation in that aspect. And for us as agricultural economists, of course, that's kind of putting the farmer in the center of the perspective is extremely important. This is a quote from a paper from colleagues from the FIBE. Basically, see that to work for farmers, agroecology needs to make economic sense. What I'm not trying to say is that farmers are only profit maximizing, as this is the only thing that they try to achieve. But if you offer farmers an alternative that makes them worse off than before, it's very hard to convince them, even though that they have other goals, of course, than increasing profits, but just maintaining the survival of the farm is an important element. And we know that this economic viability is extremely important for farms, and also that agroecological transformation affects the economic viability of the farms because it does change yields, cost, labor demand, risk, prices, and also sometimes governmental support. And we do see that sometimes like switch to agroecological practices is making economic sense for farms, but often also not to the extent that we actually would wish that farmers make the transformation. And that also has an important time dimension because often the benefits of making the transformation is in the long run, having healthy soils, having like more stable production. But in the short run, you may have some opportunity costs. And connecting that is often difficult because farmers live in the here and now. And I mean, they know there's a benefit in 20 years, but not necessarily that is enough to make them switch exactly today. So there are these kind of like risk challenges coming, for example, if you don't use pesticides. But there are also benefits as indicated in the long run, like these resilient gains. There's also a key element, I would say, often that farmers can benefit from price markups, either by localizing markets or by labeling, for example, organic, and this gives them additional monetary incentives that are often very important for the transformation decision. And then, of course, there's also a role of the government and, for example, payments for ecosystem services. But it's very clear that on the top of economic viability, survival, say, many other things matter, and that we see in the literature, farmers are not profit maximizers, but they actually have preferences, values, personality that matter a lot. And now we come to the question of scaling up agroecology. And there we also see that literature shows that there are some open questions to discuss. So for example, there is like a strong line of literature showing that switching to agroecological practices is economically more viable for farms. Fair enough, but they usually compare the first adopters. Yeah, you have 1% of farmers switching to specific practices voluntarily. And of course, comparing those to the others, it makes sense because it was easier for them to switch. So you have the selection bias. And what is often missing in the literature is really the true causal effect of switching to agroecological practices on economic viability. That also means it's very hard to foresee that we can kind of translate the experiences of 1% of the farmers to the other 99%. Very good question you need to address. It's also a tricky question whether we can scale up price markups. We see that in the literature, sometimes farmers benefit from kind of, again, maybe this example, local markets, organic labeling, but it's hard to see how to scale it up from a few percent to a large scale. And there's a tricky question that relates to the labor issue. So often agroecological practices imply a higher labor demand, but we also face globally an increasing labor scarcity. So finding labor at the level of the farms that is qualified is increasingly a challenge. So this is one issue of scaling. A second question, and I said I don't tell stories that are nice, but I try to put the finger in where it's sometimes a bit hurting, is also that we have sometimes a goal conflict between certain developments that are going on globally in the agriculture sector and what maybe agroecological literature sometimes proposes. One, to me, important element is that our kind of agriculture systems and agri-food systems, our societies are just facing a digitalization. And we will never escape from that. It's just happening. The question is how we steer it, that it's actually fulfilling something that we actually want. And we see this rapid transformation of the agri-food systems, and there are many opportunities coming from that digital transformation if and only if it's used in a very wise way. It can increase the productivity, it can reduce the footprint and make our systems more resilient. For example, by increasing opportunities for substitution. Top right, it's a weeding robot developed in ETH that actually uses laser to control the weeds. So this is a classical substitution. So no pesticides, no herbicides used in that example. However, digital technologies can be also used to redesign agriculture. This is a site by the south, close to Vernon, where basically you see that a bit like decomposing large fields and large structures into small elements and actually operating really very diverse and diverse in the sense of that you really produce crops there where they are well suited and you have a diverse mixture. And this is also enabled by digital technologies in that example. But it's not only stuff that you see on the field, new machinery, but it's also digital connections between people. People in terms of knowledge sharing, extension, advisory networks, and so on, which I feel is a game changer for our future. However, this transformation to digital technologies brings also a lot of limitations and challenges, cost, risk, for example, in economic, social, and ethical dimensions. And in some part of the literature, you call that using kind of like digital technologies to make the transformation what they call fake or junk agroecology, because it's kind of like perceived as only using new technology to fix a broken system. It may increase energy use. It just is there for the sake of producing capital for those that promote commercial processes. So there's quotes from papers that you see linked. So you see also some opposition against that in saying agroecology is definitely not that what you see there in the book, right? And this is a bit the question like how to move ahead. And one, of course, is having digital innovations mainly focusing on transformational steps, and also developing open and open, inclusive approaches that avoid digital divides, so that some benefit and some not, and also clarify many open questions. Another question of concern is this one, and these are two titles of papers: can agroecology and CRISPR mix? And the other one, genetic engineering at the heart of agroecology. I think that's a painful question. What is the role of new breeding technologies for agroecology? And that's, I mean, this is where we have a lot of areas of tension, and also for important reasons. Because first of all, breeding technologies, whether they are old or new, often have the potential to kind of contribute to the goals that we indicated in the beginning: increasing pest and disease resistance, reducing pesticides, higher nutrient efficiency, adapting to climate change, and so this is good. And also, many new plant breeding technologies have the potential to not only serve the few handful of varieties that we mainly focus on currently, but also contribute to locally adapted varieties and the larger diversity. But there are many concerns associated with that. Perceived risk to biodiversity, the environment, human health. It's very tricky to see how coexistence can be between things that have been produced with new breeding technologies like CRISPR-Cas and those that are not. And you also see that one quote here, basically some of the agroecological literature sees itself as being rooted in simply in opposition to new breeding technologies, and that of course makes it very hard to open the arms and say, well, I see the benefit. And this is very tricky because in terms of scaling at higher level, there might be need for this integration. And again, quoting completely in that case, we need a comprehensive culture of innovation, disentangle the new technologies from the bad agricultural practices, the property rights, the distribution questions they are associated with, trying to find models that actually can integrate both, overcome the limitations, and benefit for the bigger something. And that's something that was also here packed on the technological sovereignty, centering technology development in farmer preferences, and also co-creating technologies. Something that is really interesting, an aspect like participatory breeding that really localizes and integrates into co-development processes where this can be brought together. Just a few policy reflections. That's my almost the last slide. So it's very clear that we do see that various institutions take agroecology in their policy documents at the international level, but also in specific countries. We also see that, especially for Europe, if we look at the current agricultural policies, they are not that way off in terms of what goal they actually propose. So there's an overlap, but in other countries it's less. So it's an opportunity to integrate agroecology as an important policy instrument, even more important. However, we do see that kind of like these coherent and large policy shifts at the multinational frameworks are needed, and these are missing. So we need to integrate it, in my opinion, in higher national and global policy levels. Need to kind of like address also different policy instruments that might be dedicated explicitly or also benefit from other instruments. And to me, maybe important, the last point, holistic food systems policies are needed. So not only looking at agriculture, but also looking at the food system that fulfills everything that we want, and don't do things in isolation. Because if we reduce production in one place on the earth, we do have to import likely food from another one. We have leakage, spillovers, and so on. So this is the last slide to wrap up. Many steps are needed to transform our agri-food systems. Agroecology offers a comprehensive solution. The current framing often limits the larger and global reach and scale. It's a question that we can discuss whether this is needed, but if we want to have transformation of our agri-food systems at large, we need it. And if going that way, we propose basically from the paper 6 different steps, integrating it in a full multi-scale food system approach, integrating all actors, and that means producers, consumers, policymakers, but also the industry that plays an important role down and upstream, and also integrating retailers and other actors, Co-designing is at the very heart of all steps, whether that starts from breeding to landscapes and even policies co-design. So that calls for tools like living labs. We do need more evidence on the sustainability, economic, social, environmental of agroecological related food system changes. And we also need an openness to new and emerging technologies. And last but not least, policy and public policy can play an important role here and can support that process by using a holistic food system policy framework. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Yes, these are the hidden slides. I'm going to continue a bit with giving also a science perspective on agroecological transition, complementing also what Robert just said. So as Martin just said before, repetition is key. But a few other perspectives on our agricultural and food system. Basically, at the moment, we have lost 75 to 90% of our agrobiodiversity, 1/3 of our arable land to soil degradation, and industrial agriculture is generating, well, covers 80% of the land, goes up to 30% of greenhouse gas emission, uses 70% of fresh water, and produces less than half of the food that we consume. Another thing is that our food system are overstepping planetary boundaries and for a safe operating space for humanity, and also 10% the richest human beings on Earth are generating basically more than 50% of the greenhouse gas emission. That shows also how power concentration basically within the food system are spread as such. On another perspective, on another hand, what we have is that 1% of the farms basically control 70% of the farmland. And what it means is that a loss of access to and control over the land, especially for small-scale producers, is a big threat for food security in general. When I talk about small-scale producer, as I said, industrial agriculture is not doing the job of human beings. And here in this graph, what I find fascinating is that the ones that have farms smaller than 2 hectares, like around the world, are actually providing 30% of the food. And if we go to 5-hectare land, like all the farms that are below 5 hectares, they're the one basically percent, so half of the population, which is very important to keep in mind. On the other hand, what we do have is a huge power concentration when it comes to certain inputs. So typically, like 10 companies, 56% of the activities related to fertilizer, 4 related to 80% of the activity related to pesticide, and only 3 related to 60% of the activities on the seed sector, which I'll let it sink within you. But this means also that on one hand, we have an industrial agriculture that needs to build knowledge to reduce their chemical inputs, to diversify and relocalize. And on the other hand, the subsistence agriculture that needs to build knowledge, eventually mechanize and diversify as well and connect to the market. All in all, this should be a transition towards a diversified agroecological system. And for this, agroecology has fine already, but repetition is key. And one thing that I still want to focus on, maybe that needs to be very clear. I don't know where to stand with the video, I'm sorry. Okay, I move. Is basically that agroecology is obviously a realm where you have science, practice, and social movement. And the idea here is really to transition into a sustainable system that is built on the foundation of equity, participation, and justice. Without this, this is not agroecology. And so eventually, if we want to carry evidence-based towards this agroecological transition or regenerative approaches or indigenous foodways, then it means that we will need to collect narratives, practices, wisdoms, cosmogonies, and also obviously nourish this with scientific analysis, case studies, and data. And because here we're in ETH, I'm mostly going to focus on the scientific analysis, the case studies, especially of our research group, and some of the data that we collected from different angles that would basically carry also this transition. Maybe a quick element. So you've seen this from Robert in another framework. So these are the 10 elements of agroecology that are also displayed as the 13 principles. One thing that I simply want to show you here is that those principles of agroecology are can be located more on an agroecosystem level. But then eventually, when we bring social values, diets, participation, responsible governance, connectivity or co-creation of knowledge, then we're talking more of a system scale. So we talked a lot about scales, and this is exactly what I'm going to do now. Go through several different scales, our multi-layered research in the sustainable agroecosystem group, starting with the soil actually. So with this, I forgot my notes, but that's fine. What I want to show you here is that we basically our group starts with the soil structure and the microbiome of the agroecosystem. And here is a very nice but also comprehensive illustration that shows on one hand industrial agriculture that really is about maximizing the yield, that relies on intensive soil management, chemical fertilizers, pesticides as well, and use highly productive plants in usually a very simple system that leads to degraded soil. And eventually, on the other hand, what you could have is also conservation agriculture. And conservation agriculture is basically more protective approaches towards soil management. It reduces or it brings much more diversity, crop rotation, agroforestry, and all in all, this has the potential to first regenerate the soil, but also maintain it towards a sustainable dimension. So conservation practices here within have like beneficial effects, obviously, on not only soil structure, but on the flows, be it of water, nutrients, oxygen, and so on. And from this is a big part of our research in the sustainable ecosystem group is conducted on both soil biota, nutrient recycling, biogeochemical modeling, and so on. But I thought I would bring you to like some case studies that are actually quite interesting. The first one takes us to Malawi. And here in Malawi, what I want to show you is that those subsistence farming systems that we talked about. Here, what you do see is, basically a farmer's field that was taken by basically the researcher that conducted this study, Janina Dirks. And what I want to draw your attention on is the trees all around here that are called Fidelia trees. And those Fidelia trees, they grow around maize and other crops. And what's interesting is that it's leguminous, basically. So they will capture nitrogen and they will spread it for their root system to the maize. And here the experimentation was really to try to understand what was happening between the maize plants, the roots, and the AMF, and what it is. And here to really try to understand, like basically those nutrients that are around, how they are collected by this tree, and then spreaded to the other plants, aka the maize. So the big focus was done on this MAF, so arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And here, really, the idea was to see a bit how those two were behaving in this agroforestry system. And what was fascinating to understand is that the soil structure, but also all the nutrient content around this Fidelia tree showed we're having a very wide impact zone of around 15 meters. And the nitrogen fixing trees in this very simple agroforestry system with basically like this tree and the maize were really significantly improving the nitrogen budget of farmers' field. Basically, they didn't really have to, or they couldn't on one hand, also they didn't have to go and fetch other type of input. The tree was performing this type of nutrient fixation and redistribution, which was quite interesting. Now then, if we move it to another type of agroforestry system, this one is for, is a dynamic agroforestry system in Ghana. that we study. And here the idea for us is to see a bit from a cocoa monoculture to well, diverse agroforestry system, basically how much shade should we have to produce what we need. And here the big focus was on cacao. And so the study that was done is really to take different type of shade, like different ranges from 0 to 70% of bigger trees shading over the cocoa trees, and try to see what would be the trade-offs and understand what it would mean for diverse indicators. This is how a dynamic agroforestry system would look like. And basically several elements, just like the yield, the soil fertility, also the soil moisture, also the carbon in the trees or in the soil were measured. And what was interesting is to see a bit, or to have this exercise of understanding that there is a need to dance with trade-offs, to be a bit more nuanced, and not as that's a bit the call of Robert, I imagine, as well at some point, is just to bring really critical discussion on well, not very dichotomic solutions. So how can we dance with those trade-offs? And basically, there is absolutely no silver bullet solution, but here the idea is really to be able to consider different indicators. Eventually, the study was brought up after a few years into a different layer, and here other researchers, through a meta-analysis, trying to better understand what would be the trade-off, not only with the indicators I showed you, but also typically like here, economic, what would be the economic performance, trying to compare both and to see how advantage it would be. Or also the same study is basically bringing yield difference. So instead of looking only at cocoa yield, where in agroforestry system, this would decrease. Well, basically, if we take into account all the yield of an agroforestry system with other fruits, papaya, mango, whatever, timber, and so on, what would it mean as well? So this is just a bit to stretch out to what could be done. And now eventually we moved from soil to the cropping system, farming system. And I would like to also present you some of the research that we're doing more at the meta level, basically, or at least a bigger level, not meta level. And here it's one of our research projects called RunRes, that is basically, well, it stands for Rural Urban Nexus, establishing a nutrient loop to improve city region food system resilience. A bit of a heavy name, so RunRes will be. And basically what we do is that we use transdisciplinary approaches in the research. So with not only researchers, but also policymakers, also entrepreneurs as well, with also farmers, obviously, we create a space of discussion and try basically to understand the problem, and then try to understand what could be the collective action and implementation in order to fix the problem. This problem is basically the reality that was the linearity of our food system. The fact that from farming to trading, processing, and consuming, we were basically wasting a lot, generating a lot of waste, and also well, leading to different type of other outcomes that are very negative for the environment, such as like that could be a sanitation. Like when you're a consumer and in different contexts, you don't have access to proper sanitation. It's also food security. The farmer, you might not have the exact amount of inputs needed for you to be able to grow as much as you want. So really try to tackle this from a very circular perspective. So yes, on one hand, what I find interesting here is that agroecology is not only focusing on the plot and on farmers, but also trying to understand that it really goes beyond. It's about also waste management. It's about also sanitation. It's about many other elements. And so here then from urban, very linear system, the idea was to bring those circularity dimension by different type of innovations. And here I think it goes a bit hand in hand with this idea that certain innovation should come into place, but maybe discuss what is considered an innovation or what could be considered as a technology or no. So I'm going to show you some of them. Maybe innovation number one disappeared, but well, the first one that we had, or one of the biggest one carried, is composting. And here what I put aside from the pictures of this innovation is basically other type of innovation that are developed in one here, but the 4 countries where RunRes is basically operating, which is DRC Congo, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and South Africa. And it's within those municipalities that those type of innovation are implemented. Then what we have is another one that is called tiger worm toilet, where basically we put tiger worms in the back of the toilet like this, and they're the one taking care of the feces and degrading it. So this is an example of tiger worm toilet that was set in Rwanda. But we then have also black soldier flies as a way bring waste. And then those black soldier fly are actually used as animal feed. So here we have another loop that is installed in that food system. Another one would be basically to do something with the cassava peels. So not so much in Switzerland, not at all actually. But cassava is widely consumed in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And here the idea is really also to understand what can be done with the peel that then is, this is, for example, after a market day. What can we do with this? And this actually, with a very small type of technology, is well treated so that at least like the toxic elements are flushed away. And then what you keep is elements that could be used for animal feed once again, so as an input for the farmer. And eventually, in South Africa, for example, here what we have, or the picture is a co-composting. So it's basically a mix between compost and human waste, so fecal sludges and so on. And here it's basically a sort of enriched compost that then is distributed and well sold to the inhabitants of this municipality that is called Missenduzi. And one other element that we have in South Africa that I find quite resonating with some of the solutions that Robert was mentioning is the living lab. So for you to know a living lab, what it is, it's basically an open innovation ecosystem, so a real life space where you would have users, you would have private actors, you would have researchers, like us, knowledge institutes, and public actors. And together, in an enabling context as well, they would try to test and implement those solutions or those approaches towards an agroecological possibilities. And here the idea is really focusing on co-creation. So when I was talking about power as well, the idea here is really to be able to look on a high level to all the other stakeholders of our food system, not only farmers, but obviously farmers, but more entrepreneurs as well and so on, in order really to be able to foster solutions. One of them would be the Agroecological Living Lab in Missenduzi in South Africa, where actually we linked that space to our teaching activities in ETH and try really to develop like outreach material for the farmers around or for the school kids around. And this is also a very important part of agroecology to really be able to launch it at multi-level. This is the masterpiece of some of our students last year. And those masterpieces went back to some of the key stakeholders of the project, really to be able to implement it and really like bring this agroecology a bit outside. I'm not going to talk about the 2 other case studies, but if you have any questions, it's basically on other agroecological living lab all around Africa that through a project called Canal. And the last project that we're focusing on is really focusing more on the nutrition aspect and agroecological production. And this is done in different countries as well in sub-Saharan Africa, Rwanda, Kenya, but also Bangladesh. And really here also the multi-layered type of approach, be it with the field, but also the consumers and also the policymakers is really done in order really to foster this change. One last thing, I have 10 seconds left, is to mention that also here, and this is part of today's lecture, but the whole month of October in Switzerland will be the Days of Agroecology. This is also a way to reach out towards those topics. One space that we do have that is really dedicated to this is the greenhouse that is 5 minutes away from here. And all in all, these are the perspectives or way that in which we can basically like enter from a scientific perspective into the agroecological transition. I think.
Thank you very much for ending on a quite positive note as well. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, Kenza. Thank you, Robert, for being with us. Thank you for all who were on Zoom with us. Apparently there was some audio problem, especially at the end. So we will make our best to improve for next time. So we are looking forward to see you next week again for the second round of this mini series. And we will get some insight from a policy perspective on agriculture. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening. Goodbye.